So it's my pleasure to welcome everyone here to What Matters to Me and Why at UC Irvine. This is our second season, and this is the inaugural talk of the second season. And so it's great to see many of you who have been here before. Hopefully there are also people new to the UCI community who are here, and it's just very gratifying to see the interest in this series. What Matters to Me and Why was started with the goal of letting members of the UCI community talk about their personal journeys, basically. We have a lot of talks at university.
I can't hear you. Jonathan, either speak louder or turn up the volume.
Okay, so how's this? This better? Thank you for the loud physicist in the back there. Okay, so let me start again just by saying welcome again. It's really good to see everybody here. And I was just about to describe a bit of what matters to me and why, the goals and what we're hoping to achieve through this. This was started with the idea that we could hear people from UCI talk about their personal journeys, basically. And basically, just simply answer the question, what matters to me and why? In a university setting, we see lots of talks. People talk about their research, their academic work. But sometimes it's interesting to see what brought the people that are here. And oftentimes you don't get that if you're just listening to them in a lecture or talking with them as their neighbors down the hall. And so we'd like to provide a chance to see that. We'd like to hear about personal journeys, both ups and downs, how those shape people, how they form their beliefs, their commitments, their motivations, what they found wonderful in life, what they didn't find so wonderful in life, and how that informs what they do here now. And so this has been a fantastic chance. We've had faculty, staff, and students all giving us positive input, and so it's just really nice to be able to start a second season of this. Before I introduce Doug Haynes, who will introduce our speaker, let me say a few things about future speakers. This series is held 7 times a year, so it's on the second Wednesday of every month, except for December and June. Okay? So second Wednesday of every month, there'll be 7 of them. Our next one is therefore on November 13th. It'll be Professor Nicole Mitchell. She's a professor of music in the Claire Trevor School of the Arts. It should be fascinating, flautist, composer, and artist, and that will be a very interesting talk. Then farther down the line, Chancellor Drake will be giving this talk on February the 12th, and we're very, very happy to hear that. When John Stupar and I went and proposed this series to him about a year and a half ago, his enthusiastic support was really a big help and very basically essential to get this thing off the ground and make it a reality. So it's nice that he'll be participating as a speaker very soon. There is a website for this series, which you probably all saw because you registered there. And let me just remind you that it has the schedule. You'll see, for example, there are blanks under several of the dates. If you have suggestions for speakers, we welcome those. There's a questionnaire that you probably got. Just drop it in the box on your way out, and we read all of them and are very interested to hear what you think. On there also are links to the YouTube videos. So if you missed last season, there were fantastic talks. Some of the speakers are here in this room. You can see them all. They all consented to being videotaped and put on YouTube, and so they're all there, and I encourage you to take a look at those. With that video business in mind, I've been asked to encourage you, if you do not want to appear in the video, this video, then don't sit in the front row. Somehow switch seats with someone who's not so adverse to that in the back. Okay? And second of all, there are restrooms. You go out the door here and turn right, you'll find restrooms. So without further ado, let me just introduce Doug Haynes.
Good afternoon. First, I want to just recognize Jonathan and John for bringing this opportunity to the campus, because it's been a wonderful event for the entire campus, students, staff, and faculty. So I just want to publicly acknowledge you for that work. And following Jonathan, I want to add my welcome to you today to What Matters to Me. As he mentioned, we're kicking off our second season, and I'm particularly delighted to introduce our speaker for this fall. But before I do, I just want to relate a little story. About 2 years ago, my daughter, Elaine, and I visited the nation's capital. Like others, we managed to take a tour of the U.S. Supreme Court. She was 14 years old and attended Vista Verde Middle School. And if you must know, I was much younger. As we sat in the court, taking in the interior, and imagining the exchanges between attorneys and judges, Elena leaned over and said to me, quote, "This is where Mara's dad works," unquote. Dean Chermerinsky is closely linked to the law as a living institution that deeply affects the lives of all people. As my daughter mentioned, he is a constitutional lawyer who regularly argued cases before the nation's highest court. Many of you, no doubt, have read his many op-ed pieces in the LA Times and New York Times on some of the most pressing issues of the day. But today I'm particularly happy to say that Dean Chermerinsky's day job is here at UCI. He is the founding dean of UCI Law School, distinguished professor of law, and Raymond Pryke professor of First Amendment law. Please join me in welcoming Dean Chermerinsky.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction and a very warm welcome. Bertrand Russell, the English philosopher and historian, began his autobiography by saying, "Three passions, simple but overwhelmingly strong, have governed my life: the longing for love, the search for knowledge, and the unbearable pity for the suffering of mankind." I was so honored to be asked to speak here today. It gave me the chance for some introspection about what really matters to me. I cannot pretend to be as eloquent as Bertrand Russell, but I too can identify three things that govern my life. What's most important to me, my family, social justice, education, now the University of California at Irvine, and particularly UCI Law School. In terms of the first of these, what's truly the most important to me, my family. I'm married. My wife, Catherine Fisk, is a law professor here at UCI. I often say in total sincerity that the best thing that UCI got by hiring me as dean was getting Catherine to be a part of the faculty. She's an expert in labor and employment law. She was a chaired professor at Duke Law School when she agreed to come here to be part of creating the law school. There's no doubt that I try to juggle too many things. It simply wouldn't be possible if I didn't have such a supportive and even indulgent spouse. 4 children. My oldest, Jeff, is 30 and a lawyer in Los Angeles. He's married to Kim, who's also a lawyer in Los Angeles. It's worth saying a word about how they met. It even relates to Doug's introduction. Kim was my research assistant when I was a professor at Duke Law School, and I was arguing a case in the United States Supreme Court. I always make it a practice of taking my students who worked on the case with me wherever I argue in court. My son was taking a year between college and law school and working in Los Angeles, and he came and watched the argument. After I argue a case, we all go to lunch together, and Jeff and Kim sat together. The following fall, he was a first-year law student at Duke, while she was a third-year student, and having met the previous December, they quickly began dating. I told this story as part of the toast at their wedding, and then I pointed out I lost that case 8-0. But I still regard it as my most successful day in court ever. My second son is Adam. He's 27. He's finishing a master's in education at USC and working now in San Diego in marketing. He's probably the sweetest person who I've ever met. I have a son, Alex, who's 19, who's a sophomore at Tulane, and a daughter, Mara, who's 15, who's a sophomore in high school. I was asked about 2 years ago for a publication for law students to write about what I found to be the largest challenge in my career. and I have no hesitation in choosing a topic. I find the hardest thing is how to balance work and family. I find it to be a daily, a weekly, and a monthly struggle. There is always more I want to do with regard to my career, more to prepare for class, more in terms of writing, more in terms of administrative responsibilities, more in terms of cases. And yet, I truly believe that no one on his or her deathbed ever says, I wish I had spent more time at the office. And so I try very hard to block off time for my family, limiting the number of evenings a week I'm out, limiting how often I'm away on weekends. Sometimes I succeed, and often I fail. If you look at the number of nights I've been out this month, you would say I don't do a very good job of this balance. But it's constantly in mind, and is what I think is one of the hardest challenges for any professional. I often tell my students, there's no assurance that if you work hard, you will succeed. No matter how hard I worked, I couldn't be center for the Lakers or shortstop for the Cubs. But I can also tell my students that unless they work hard, it's almost guaranteed they can't succeed. So how do we balance the hard work that's necessary for professional success with the desire to have a wonderful family and make them truly the highest priority in one's life? So that's why I begin by saying what matters to me most, my family. Second, I care deeply about social justice. I decided to go to law school because I believe that law is the most powerful tool for social change. I was inspired to go to law school by the stories of the civil rights lawyers of the 1950s and the 1960s. I didn't know any lawyers growing up. I think the first lawyer I ever met was whoever was the first law professor I met, who was an attorney. I grew up in a working class family on the south side of Chicago. Neither of my parents ever went to college. My dad worked in a home improvement store, like a Builder's Emporium or a Lowe's. It was called Courtesy Home Center. My mom always worked in the home. My mom got married when she was 18. I was born when she was 20. Neither my brother nor sister ever went to college. My brother's an electrician on the south side of Chicago. My sister works in the home, works in her synagogue, takes care of a special needs child. I have spent so much time thinking about how I ended up on such a different path than the rest of my family. Undoubtedly, so many individuals contributed to that in the course of my life. No person is self-made, and I'm surely not. In fact, there was a friend of my father's who encouraged him to have me take a test to try to get into the University of Chicago laboratory schools for high school. If you're familiar with it, the University of Chicago Laboratory Schools are a very prestigious school affiliated with the University of Chicago. They were created long ago by John Dewey to be the laboratory for his educational ideas. I had gone to the local public schools through 8th grade. My dad wasn't familiar with the lab schools, but decided it'd be a good thing for me to take a test to go there. Tested, I was lucky enough to get in, I was lucky enough to get a partial scholarship. My junior year of high school, my dad became very seriously ill and was out of work. There was literally no family income during that year. So my family couldn't afford the half of the tuition which we were required to pay. I was on the debate team in high school, and the debate coach went to the school and he asked if they would be willing to make up the difference in the scholarship. And he was told that they had a firm policy, they never gave more at that time at least, than 50% scholarships. My debate coach, my social studies teacher, Earl Bell, told the school he would quit his job unless they made up the difference in my scholarship. And I have every reason to believe he was serious about that. He put his job on the line so I would be able to continue to go to school there. I did. I graduated from that high school and then went on to college. If you talked to me at any point while I was in college, I'd have told you what I wanted to do was to be a high school teacher. I took all of the courses at Northwestern, where I went to college, to be a certified high school teacher. I did my student teaching at Highland Park High School, one of the northern suburbs of Chicago. I received my certification to be a social studies teacher. Unless it expires, I think I'm still a certified high school teacher. And it was in the summer before my senior year that I first began to think about going to law school. And I have to tell you, the reason is I wanted to see how I could make a difference in society. And I don't want to deprecate those who are elementary and high school teachers. They make an enormous difference in the way they affect people's lives. But I really was inspired by the civil rights lawyers of the 1950s and the 1960s. I applied to law school in my senior college about as late as you can. I took the December LSAT, which I think is still the last one you can take with hope of going to law school the following year, and did well enough that I was admitted to and decided to enroll at Harvard Law School. I went there with the goal of being a public interest lawyer. In my second year of law school, all of the law firms came, as they do now, to interview prospective students. I had the grand total of 0 interviews. It wasn't that I was rejected to be interviewed. They have to interview whoever signs up there, as is the case here. I didn't sign up for any interviews. I didn't want to go to work at a law firm. I respect my colleagues, and that was the desired path, but I wanted very much to be a civil rights lawyer, a public interest lawyer. I was able to find such a job, worked there in the summer of my second year, and then after graduation, I went to first the United States Department of Justice, and then to a small public interest law office. After that, I became a law professor. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But ever since being a law professor, I've continued to spend a great deal of my time with regard to what I regard as social justice work. I've continued to handle cases primarily on appeal. I think at this point I've probably argued over 100 appeals in courts around the country, including several times in the United States Supreme Court. Virtually all of these cases I've handled pro bono without charge. One of the wonderful things about being a law professor is we're paid a good salary, so I haven't needed to do paid consulting. Argued, as Doug mentioned, several cases in the Supreme Court. The first time I ever argued in the Supreme Court was on behalf of a man named Leandro Andrade. He was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 50 years for stealing $153 worth of videotapes from Kmart stores in San Bernardino, California. He received that sentence under California's 3 strikes law, even though he had never committed a violent felony. As Justice Stevens pointed out, unfortunately in dissenting opinion, no one in the history of the United States had ever received a life sentence for shoplifting before California's 3 strikes law. I was asked to represent him pro bono in the Federal Court of Appeals. I did. I won. The state of California sought Supreme Court review. It was granted, and I lost 5-4. Second time I ever argued in the Supreme Court, I received a phone call from a homeless man by the name of Thomas Van Orden. It was a collect call. I've represented enough prisoners that I always accept collect phone calls, though I'd never heard of Thomas Van Orden. He said he just that day lost a case in the Federal Court of Appeals challenging a 10 Commandments monument that sits directly at the corner of the Texas State Capitol and the Texas Supreme Court. It's 6 feet high and 3 feet wide, begins with the words, "I am the Lord thy God." And he said, would I be willing to try to take his case to the Supreme Court? I said, I haven't read the opinion yet, it just came down. Can I call you back? He very matter-of-factly said to me, I'm homeless, I don't have a phone, but we set up a time for me to call you back. I decided to ask for Supreme Court review on his behalf. It was granted, and I argued his case because I deeply believe in the wall that separates church and state. I lost that case 5-4 too. I'm going to argue another case in the Supreme Court on December 4th of this year on behalf of a man by the name of Dennis Appel. One of the things that we've created in our law school is a number of clinics where we represent individuals. It's the students who handle the cases under faculty supervision. Every year I supervise 2 students who brief and argue a case in the Federal Court of Appeals. We were appointed to represent Dennis Appel. He's a very devout Christian. Based on his beliefs, he often engages in protests against the military and especially nuclear weapons. He protests outside of Vandenberg Air Force Base. 7 years ago, he was part of a demonstration where blood was thrown against a wall at Vandenberg, and the commander of the base issued a bar letter prohibiting him from coming onto the base in the future. Vandenberg is a closed base. In order to enter, you've got to go through a guard. The government's painted a green line on the road. When you cross the green line, you're deemed to be part of the base. Just the other side of the green line, in the public area, is Pacific Coast Highway, Highway 1. It's designated as a protest zone. Dennis Appel repeatedly went to protest peacefully on that stretch of Highway 1. But the military said, you're covered by a bar order. This is technically land owned by the federal government, even though an easement was granted to the state of California and county of Santa Barbara. He was convicted several times. My students argued his case in the Federal Court of Appeals in April of 2012. They won. The United States sought Supreme Court review. It was granted, and the case will be argued in December. I'm not going to go through each of the cases I've argued in the Supreme Court. I'm not going to go through all the lower court cases I argued. I mentioned these just to give you an example, the types of things I work on. I've argued a couple of death penalty cases in the Federal Court of Appeals. I lost both. One of my clients has been executed. Another remains on death row. Handled, as you can tell, both criminal and civil cases. Now, all of the cases share in common that I'm representing people who can't afford representation. I get to pick and choose the cases, and so I have the opportunity to work for the things that I really care about. Freedom of speech, the wall that separates church and state, the rights of criminal defendants, equality in society. I've also had the opportunity to pursue this commitment to social justice in non-litigation forum. When I first started teaching, I got to work in drafting and was the co-author of the Freedom of Information Act that the Illinois legislature enacted. It was a fascinating experience with a colleague to literally draft the bill and then go lobby for it to be adopted. In 1997, I received a phone call from a member of the Los Angeles City Council, Jackie Goldberg. If any of you remember Jackie, she was a very outspoken, forceful presence, and she said she wanted me to do a favor for her. And usually what she did was call and ask me for $100 for the next election campaign. And I said, sure. And she said, I want you to run to be elected to the Los Angeles City Charter Reform Commission. And I sort of said, no, let's talk about this. Well, it turns out that the Los Angeles Charter had been adopted in 1925. It had been amended 400 times. It had become an incoherent document. The charter is like the Constitution for a city. It creates the institutions of city government. It allocates powers among them, prescribes many means for how it's going to operate, and it even includes protection of individual rights. My initial instinct was, since this was a 2-year volunteer position, I couldn't possibly do it with my other commitments. That year I was the president of the Academic Senate at USC. I was teaching a full load. I was involved in cases. But I talked with my family about it. I think my kids had the idea there was going to be lawn signs and commercials with my name on it, so it was a good idea. The way it was to work was there were 15 city council districts in Los Angeles, and one representative to the Charter Commission was to be chosen from each. I was one of 7 candidates in my council district, and amazingly, they elected a lawyer or a law professor without a runoff. And I then spent the next 2 years of my life part of the political process, drafting and then campaigning for election of the charter. In June of 1999, the voters of Los Angeles, by a 60% to 40% margin, approved the charter that we had drafted. There is no way to describe to you in the few minutes we have how intense and overwhelming the experience was. It truly took over my life for those 2 years. I would receive phone calls from one charter commissioner, usually around 6 in the morning, and another usually 11 at night, and that doesn't describe all of the calls in between. We began meeting one night a week, then became one night and a weekend day, then became a few nights and a weekend day, until ultimately the charter got adopted. But, at least until I became part of creating UCI Law School, I'd never been part of anything I learned so much from, and at least until I became part of UCI Law School, I've never been involved in anything that I'm so proud of. It's the charter that ultimately emerged from all of that work. As a result of that, a couple years later, I was asked to do a study of the Los Angeles Police Department as a result of the Rampart scandal. It was a fascinating experience. Got to interview over 100 police officers and came away with such deep respect for what they do and their commitment to their work. And then that led to my being appointed to be chair of a commission on contracting in the city of Los Angeles that emerged as a result of a scandal. I feel so fortunate to have all of these experiences. They've certainly given me the chance to work on my commitment to social justice, but also to learn so much. I'm sometimes asked where my commitment to social justice comes from. It's a difficult thing to answer. Some of it is probably the time period when I grew up. I was in high school during the Vietnam War and college during the last years of the Vietnam War. I participated in anti-war protests in high school and college. I think I was influenced by the fact that I went to high school on a university campus where protests was often present. Undoubtedly, my family and my cultural background matter a great deal to this as well. I grew up in a fairly observant Jewish family. I was taught for a young age that a key part of Judaism is the concept of tikkun olam. Tikkun olam means the obligation of every individual to help heal the broken world. And I think no matter what our religion, or if we have no religion, we all have the obligation to use our time, talents, our energy, to try to make the world a better place. The third thing that I deeply care about, that I want to talk about, is education. I realized at a fairly young age that what I loved most is teaching. I had the chance in the summer of 1973 to teach a program for high school students at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And nothing I ever did was more enjoyable than that. Now I have to tell you, up to that point, my summer jobs were all doing things that weren't particularly enjoyable. The summer before that, I worked unloading trucks at UPS, and if anybody's not built to unload trucks. The summer before that, I worked in a factory where literally what I did was pick up a gear, spray it with oil and kerosene, wrap it in wax paper, and did that for 8 hours a day. So the idea that I could have a job where I'd get paid for doing something I liked was really revolutionary. I remember in college, I sometimes knew people who said they wanted to drop out of college to go work with their hands or on a farm. And that was the last thing that I wanted to do. I wanted to do something where I could be paid for thinking and for talking. And so I discovered that I loved teaching, which is why I wanted to be a high school teacher. So I decided to go to law school. Always in the back of my mind was the idea that someday I could become a law professor. I had no idea how one would go about it. I was practicing in Washington, D.C., working for a public interest law office. I was married. My wife was a law student at Georgetown. And one day I went to meet her, and I was hanging around till she was done with class or her meeting. And I saw a letter on the bulletin board written by the dean at DePaul Law School asking LLM students, advanced law students, to apply for teaching jobs there. The letter was 2 years old, but nobody had taken it down. I was not an LLM student, but we'd each grown up in Chicago, and so I decided to write a letter to the dean saying I might be interested in a teaching position. This was April of 1980. I knew enough to know they'd already hired for the following school year. And besides that, my wife had one more year of law school to go at Georgetown. So I wrote, being totally naive, and said I'd be interested in a teaching position for the fall of 1981. Got a very sweet phone call back from the associate dean there. He began by saying the dean that I had written to had died the previous year. So I had written to a dead dean. When he'd gotten my letter and looked at my credentials, they had no openings for the following fall. I wasn't interested for the following fall, but he said, if ever you're going to be in Chicago, why don't we have lunch together? Well, we were going to Chicago the following week to have Passover with our family, and so I'll be in Chicago next week, so let's have lunch. We had a delightful lunch. He explained to me how one goes onto the market to become a professor. We said we'd be in touch the following fall. Well, a week later he calls me and said, somebody is unexpectedly going on leave. We need someone to teach constitutional law, which you say is your area of interest. Would you like to come and interview? I said, sure. I came and interviewed a week later on a Thursday, and on Friday morning they offered me a position as an assistant professor. They were desperate. I taught my first class in August of 1980, and I went home afterwards and said to my wife, I've discovered what I want to do for the rest of my life. I continue to teach a full load as dean because it is the thing that I love doing most. There are moments in the middle of the night when I worry that I've sold out what I really should be doing, being a civil rights lawyer, a legal aid lawyer, for what I enjoy most, education. But I rationalize by saying that by being a teacher, it gives me the opportunity to try to inspire the next generation of lawyers to go out and use their talents to really make a difference in society. Also, I have the opportunity to write. A great deal about what I write is social justice. I write op-ed pieces, I write law review articles, I write books to try to advance my view of social justice. I also write to educate a larger audience about the law. One of the unusual choices I made back in 1994 and 1995 was to be a daily commentator on the O.J. Simpson case. And those of you who are old enough to remember the O.J. Simpson case remember that it was literally on the media all day, every day. And in an inadvertent way, I started and then continued to do media commentary on it. I was still teaching a full load. I would teach class in the morning, run to the studio, be a commentator, go back and teach in the afternoon, then go back to the studio. But the way I rationalized that was, this was the chance to explain law to a much larger audience than I'd ever be able to teach in all of the classrooms combined. I so believe in the importance of education, and honored to have the chance to spend my professional career primarily as a part of this. I taught at DePaul for 3 years, and then out of the blue I got a call to join the faculty at the University of Southern California. And I grew up in Chicago hating cold and snow. I used to watch the Rose Bowl with my father on Newsday and say, I want to go live there someday. I was teaching a night class at DePaul when the call first came from USC, and my wife's response was, he's always wanted to live someplace warm. In fact, I came out to interview in January of 1983, and it was one of those great Southern California days where the Santa Anas are blowing, the skies are blue, it's in the 80s. Landed back in Chicago over here, and the pilot with an evil laugh at, and the wind chill is 25 degrees, below zero outside. I went home and woke up my wife and said, please, can we go? It's literally a true story. Spent 21 wonderful years on the faculty at USC, and then the opportunity came to go to Duke Law School. And for a whole set of family reasons, it seemed the right thing to do at the right time. And we then went and spent 4 years at Duke, and it was a great opportunity to be part of a terrific university in a different part of the country. And Linda Cohn from the economics faculty here called me and said she was part of the Dean's Search Committee, that the Regents had approved a new law school at the University of California. And talked about who I might suggest they look at, and she asked if I might be interested. Now, we'd only been in North Carolina for a few years. We didn't have any interest in moving. But the chance to be part of a new law school seemed such a wonderful opportunity. So I came out and met briefly with the Dean's Search Committee, was invited to do 2 days of interview. The offer was made, and we decided to move out here and to be part of creating the law school. There's nothing that I've been part of that I've enjoyed more. There's nothing that I've been part of that's been more overwhelming than being part of the University of California Irvine School of Law. Can't talk about what matters to me without talking about it and UCI more generally. It's certainly what most of my waking moments have focused on for the last 6 years. It's what most of my dreams have been about as well. What's so exciting, of course, is the blank slate that we were given. The Chancellor, Michael Drake, the then Executive Vice Chancellor, Michael Gottfredson, could not have been more supportive of the new law school. They articulated only one key goal, that they wanted this to be a top 20 law school from every measure from the very outset. So much of what we've done has been geared towards that. We recruited outstanding faculty from across the country. There's a study that recently came out that ranked our faculty 7th in the United States in scholarly impact, behind Yale, Harvard, University of Chicago, Stanford, NYU, and Columbia. We have students of that caliber as well. You might have seen that a year ago, we don't have this year's results yet, our students had the second highest bar pass rate of any law school in California, only slightly behind Stanford Law School. But I've also said from the beginning that if we simply replicate other law schools, we will have failed, that we need to take advantage of the blank slate that we're given. We very much have emphasized experiential learning. I want us to do the best job of any law school in the country, preparing our students for the practice of law at the highest levels of the profession. I didn't graduate from law school ready to practice law. We can do so much better than law schools traditionally do. And we redesigned the curriculum that exists in most other places to try to achieve this. I wanted a school deeply committed to public service. I want our school to instill our students and our faculty the obligation to use their time and their energy to make society better. I can recite so many statistics to you about UCI Law School. But the ones that I think I'm most proud of are of the class that graduated in May of 2012, 98% had done pro bono work while in law school. Of the class that graduated in May of 2013, 92% did pro bono work. For both of these classes, they averaged over 100 hours of pro bono work each. Last week, UCI Law School received an award from the Western Center on Law and Poverty in Los Angeles for the work that our students did in tremendously expanding the availability of general relief welfare for those in Orange County who have no other means of subsistence. I've also wanted so much to create a warm environment, a real community for our law school. As I said, I went to Harvard Law School. There are many adjectives that would be used about Harvard Law School. Warm and nurturing would not be among them. And I realized that the culture of any institution is the product of so many small decisions. And we've had the opportunity to think in every way about how to create a culture that really is a warm community. As you may know, a dean's term at UCI is 5 years. Last year, amazingly, was my 5th year here. The chancellor was kind enough to offer me a second 5-year term, and I've accepted it. And over the next 5 years, I want to see us grow to full size. We're about 2/3 of that size now. I want to see us build a new building, and I want us to cement being not only one of the top law schools in the country, but the very best in preparing our students for the practice of law, the very best in instilling in our students a commitment to public service. I'm so incredibly blessed in all aspects of my life. I'm blessed, members of my family, with good health. Try to make sure that on a day goes by that I don't appreciate that. 31 years ago this week, I was diagnosed with cancer. I went through surgery and radiation. And I know that we're all just a single sentence from a doctor being told that we have a disease like that, and how it separates our life into before and after. Thankfully, I've been in remission all of these years, but I don't take for granted being blessed with good health. I'm blessed with a job that pays good income and with job security. I mentioned my brother's an electrician. He's been out of work most of the last 2 years because there just hasn't been much construction going on in the Chicago metropolitan area. I have the luxury of a job for life. Bertrand Russell concluded the introduction to his autobiography with the words, "This has been my life, and I would gladly live it again if only given the chance." I certainly feel that way, but since I'm only 60 years old at this point, I hope that I'll have another several decades to continue to enjoy my family, to pursue social justice, and to be a law professor. Thank you.
As is our custom, the speaker has agreed to questions and answers. We have our 2 graduate student representatives, Rebecca Thompson and Daniel Quang, who are on the committee. They'll be handling the microphones. Just a couple of do's and don'ts. Please speak into the microphone. And second, limit yourself to a question. Thank you. You got another one? Great.
Hello. So what advice would you give to undergraduate students that are considering going into law school?
The most important thing as an undergraduate in terms of law school admissions are your grades and your test scores. And anyone who tells you otherwise isn't telling you the truth. Law school admissions is about grades and test scores, grades and test scores, grades and test scores, grades and test scores. And among students with about the same grades and test scores, your letters of recommendation really matter. Make sure your letters of recommendation are from professors. Letters of recommendation from famous people or lawyers don't matter. Law school admissions committees everywhere in the country want letters of recommendation from professors who know you. And the better they know you, the more influential the letters will be. And then they give real weight to your personal statement and your life experiences. It doesn't matter what you major in college. There's no such thing as a pre-law major that law schools care about. It doesn't matter if you're a political science major, criminology major, business major, art major. Doesn't matter. Law schools want to see that you've done well. Try to do as much writing as you can in college. The most important skill in law school and as a lawyer is writing. And so taking challenging courses that have you write really matters. The LSAT, unfortunately, matters. I know how capricious standardized tests are, but I'd lie to you if I said that the LSAT doesn't matter. Beyond that, the only advice I give is to follow your passion. I get asked all the time by prospective lawyers, prospective law students, and especially their parents, is it worth it to go to law school? And I always answer with two questions in response. First, do you want to be a lawyer? Do you want to do those things that you can only do with a law degree? And second, what would you do instead, and how do you feel about that as an alternative? And if what you want to do is be a lawyer, then it's a wonderful profession. There's not a day in my life that I've regretted being an attorney and going to law school.
Way in the back, Rebecca.
This is to make sure you get your exercise and bring the microphone. And the next question is going to be up here.
Well, sorry, there's one question, but it's a follow-up. So,
Okay.
have you had to represent a client who maybe you disagreed with, whether it's their belief or their motive or the reason they're in court? And if so, how do you distance yourself from them to equally represent them?
I tell my students that every person has a right to a lawyer, but no person has the right to your time or efforts. You have to decide as a lawyer what you want to spend your time on, just as you do in any other profession. I have represented many criminal defendants who I knew to be guilty. I have no trouble doing that. As I said, both of the death penalty cases that I handled involved people who had committed the murders. Now, I believe that neither of them should have been sentenced to death. Both had terrible representation by counsel in the lower courts. And I think it's so important that every criminal defendant have aggressive, effective representation. The government has such enormous power to take away a person's liberty and even life. The only way we can make sure that it's not done to innocent people or done unfairly is to make sure that the state always has to comply with the Constitution, always has to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. And so I have no trouble representing criminal defendants to make sure that the state does meet its burdens. But yes, I've represented people who I believe to be guilty. Now, with regard to civil litigation, I do get to pick and choose the case I'm involved in the sense that since I provide representation for free, the demand is much greater than what I can do. There's an amazing demand for free legal work. Not a day goes by, including this morning, that I don't get a request by letter or email or phone call to provide representation. When I was a law professor before being dean, I generally would argue 6 to 8 appeals a year. I couldn't do more than that. Now I just do a couple of appeals a year since I'm dean. I just don't have the time that I did before. So I get to pick and choose the cases that I'm involved in. Generally, I pick and choose the cases about the things that I care most about. Sometimes just somebody calling and crying on the phone works too. It's a sad story, but I spent the last 8 years representing a man who I absolutely believe is innocent. On Monday of this week, the Supreme Court denied review in his case, and he's out now. There's nothing left for him to do. His mom called me and told me the story, and I didn't believe that it had really happened that way. And I read the transcripts, and I said, I'll represent him. And represented him now, for many, many years in many court. I lost in the Federal Court of Appeals 2-1, and then the Supreme Court denied review. Or this summer, I got a call from a very prominent lawyer in Arizona. And there was a man in Arizona, named Morton Berger, who got sentenced to 200 years in prison with no possibility of parole or clemency for being convicted of possessing 20 images of child pornography. He's never been accused of abusing a child. He wasn't accused of making the child pornography, not even of buying the child pornography. He had 20 images on his computer. And under Arizona law, it's a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in prison for each image of child pornography, and they have to run consecutively with no possibility of parole. So his sentence is 200 years in prison. I obviously believe that child pornography is awful, but his sentence is greater than what he would have gotten had he molested children. And so even though I was in a position where I wasn't going to take on other cases, I said, this is a case that I'll take on. Not to defend somebody who's child pornography, but just that to me it's cruel and unusual punishment. So I have the opportunity to pick and choose. There's always more cases that I want to get involved in than I have the time to do. I learned early on that I need to, as a professor, do appeals rather than trial work. Because in an appeal, you write your brief and you show up one day to argue in court. That's easy to reconcile with an academic schedule. Trial work, the hearings are all the time, the trial goes on forever. Early on in my time at USC, I represented the NAACP in a voting rights case in Los Angeles, and I saw how just difficult it was to reconcile a trial schedule with appellate work. I sometimes still get involved in the trial level. Probably for most of the most famous clients I ever represented were Valerie Plame and Joseph Wilson. Do you remember Valerie Plame was a CIA agent? Her husband, Joseph Wilson, was a former United States ambassador. He wrote an op-ed in the New York Times saying that President Bush was wrong and saying that Iraq was trying to get nuclear material from Africa. And then the vice president and his aides exposed Valerie Plame as being a secret agent. Once you're exposed as a secret agent, you can't be a secret agent anymore. And so I filed a lawsuit for Valerie Plame and Joe Wilson against Dick Cheney, Karl Rove, Louis Libby for violating the constitutional rights, and ended up losing 2-1 in that. And I argued that I filed that complaint in the district court and argued that case in the federal trial court and then handled the appeal. But generally, I get involved with the appellate stage, and I get to pick and choose.
Dean Chermerinsky, what are your thoughts from a constitutional perspective on some of the things we've heard recently regarding our own government? For instance, WikiLeaks or the NSA scandal?
How much time do we have? I, like I'm sure all of us, have very conflicting emotions. On the one hand, I am very troubled by the revelations of spying by our government without meeting the constitutional safeguards. The Fourth Amendment allows the government to read our papers, listen to our phone conversations, view our email, but only if they get a warrant from a judge based on probable cause. And that's because though the framers of the Constitution couldn't have imagined email, they knew that privacy really mattered. We can't trust the government. We need an independent magistrate, a judge, to decide that. And what we've learned is that both the Bush and the Obama administrations have authorized the NSA to engage in massive eavesdropping without those procedural safeguards. And I think it's important that that be revealed. And so in that sense, I'm glad that the WikiLeaks came out. On the other hand, I also realize that the government needs to be able to classify it. There are some things that can't be made public. And I don't want to leave it to any technician who has access to classified material to decide whether or not to make it public. So that's why I have the conflicting emotions. I want us to know the things that tell us that our government is abusing power, but I also want to protect the ability of the government to keep secret what truly needs to be secret. And how do we strike that balance is a very difficult question.
For the talk. A lot of the cases you mentioned sound like they could be really emotionally taxing on a lawyer. So how do you deal with some of those emotions?
One of the consequences of getting to work on the things that I care about is that I care about them very deeply. And so when I worked for Leandro Andrade, who was sentenced to 50 years in life for stealing 150,000 videotapes, I cared so much about that. I mean, I represented the Court of Appeals, I represented the Supreme Court, an enormous amount of time goes into writing a Supreme Court brief and practicing to argue. I remember the morning in 2003 when I learned that I lost 5-4 in the Supreme Court. And I remember that knowing immediately that meant that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. He was ineligible for parole to the year 2046 and be 87 years old. Now, thankfully, because of an initiative California voters passed last November, it's a different situation. But I didn't know that in 2003. I handled a death penalty case where my client's rights were really seriously violated and lost in the Federal Court of Appeals in Richmond, Virginia. The Supreme Court denied review. My students found some new evidence and presented it on a Tuesday to a state trial judge in North Carolina. I was at Duke at the time. The execution was scheduled for Thursday night. And the state trial judge stayed the execution based on this newly discovered evidence. On Thursday afternoon, the North Carolina Supreme Court lifted the stay of execution without giving any reasons. To this moment, they've never given any reasons why they lifted the stay of execution. And that night, he was executed on schedule. I was devastated by it. But I think it's important to care. One of the things I try to communicate to my students when I get to talk to them at commencement is that we teach them so much how to think and how to contemplate as law students, but we also need to remind them how important it is to care. And undoubtedly, there's emotional costs to caring. In the end, for me, at the moments that I'm discouraged, I realize there's really only two choices: to give up or to fight harder. And then there's really only one choice.
Hello? Oh, yeah. So I have a question like, could you just speak several words to best describe yourself in the past several years? And do you have some suggestions for those who want to step into the area of collaborative governance and public management, like me? Thank you.
Okay, I want to be sure I understood both questions. The microphone was good. The first question is describe myself in a few words.
Yep, in the previous years. Like.
In the previous years. A few words. I think that anyone who knows me would say hardworking. I certainly do my best to juggle teaching and writing, being a law school administrator. I'm very lucky that I get to go speak to judges and lawyers, which helps get our students hired, and my family. So I would say, the fairest description I could give that no one would dispute is hardworking. In terms of advice with regard to collaborative governance, I'll go back to the question that the first student asked about going to law school. I'd say follow your passion. What most excites you? When I talk to students, I say, what's the job that you'll be most excited to wake up every morning and go do? I feel so lucky that I love my work, that I want for you, for all my students, to have that too. And so that's what I'd say to pursue. That where your passions are, that's what you really love doing.
Yes, Dean, I represent the Interfaith Center on campus, and I always like to ask a question that relates to faith.
Sure.
So you briefly mentioned your Jewish faith, and I'd just like you to expound a little bit on it as to how it has affected your life and what matters to you, and also how has it influenced your professional life as an attorney and in some of your professional work as an attorney.
On the one hand, I'm somebody who believes that a person's religious faith is a private matter. I generally don't talk about my religious faith publicly, and yet I'm not sure I can talk about what matters to me, who I am as a person, without acknowledging the importance of my religious faith. I can't tell you that there's a direct way in which my religious faith affects what I do as a lawyer. On the other hand, there's no doubt that my values, including my commitment to social justice, comes from the faith which I was raised. It's very important to me that my children be raised Jewish. My 3 sons were all bar mitzvah, my daughter was bat mitzvah. And so in that sense, my religious faith is there. If I was asked by a psychologist to say, I am, and to list all of the things, early on that list, I am Jewish. I think for me, the social justice aspect of Judaism has really influenced what I do and who I am, even though I can't point to a direct linkage.
Thank you. We have time for about 2 more questions. Okay, 3.
Someone think of one person.
So, Erwin.
Yeah, hi, Ron.
Good to see you. Of many accomplishments you've had as a leader of the law school, I think one of the ones that also reflects your values is the diversity of the student body. And although you mentioned that it's grades and LSAT scores and so forth, I think from the outset you've also tried to recruit not just the best and brightest, but also people who come from underprivileged backgrounds and racial and ethnic diversity. Those people are also often impacted by the law in negative ways, and I think that's been really very much to your credit and your leadership. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Doug and I were talking about this before coming in. As I said, I've been a law professor for 34 years now. I've taught subjects like constitutional law and criminal procedure, in classes that are almost all white and in classes with a significant number of minority students. I will tell you that the learning experience for all, including me, is different when you have a diverse student body. Talk about affirmative action or racial profiling is very different when it's all white students compared to when you have minority students there. At USC, anytime I teach equal protection or criminal procedure, there are always African American or Latino students, it's always men, who talk about being stopped by the police just for driving while black or driving while brown. I learned a tremendous amount from that, but I also think so did all the other students in the room who just didn't know that that's something that happened on a daily basis. So I believe that diversity matters enormously in education, and I've just begun to answer as to why. I'm proud that our school is 45% students of color. To be honest, we've been more successful in recruiting Asian and Latino students than African American students. And yet we're working very hard, consistent of course with Proposition 209, the California Constitution, the US Constitution, to create a diverse student body. It's something that's priority, and also to have a very diverse faculty. And the only thing I quibble with in your question is, I see no distinction between having the best and the brightest and having a diverse student body. I believe that we can have a student body, a faculty that are equal to any in the country, and also be a very diverse student body in that building.
I just remember your question. So, I know there's a large part of your family are involved with law. Your son, for example.
My son and daughter-in-law.
Son. How much of an influence did you have on that? Did you personally mentor him?
You know, my son went all through high school and his first couple years of college saying he wanted to do anything but being a lawyer. On the other hand, from the time he was little, I predicted he might go to law school. I remember when he was in preschool, and this is a true story too. He came home from school one day and said, "Dad, I got time out today, but don't be mad at me for 2 reasons." True story. In the middle of his junior year of college, we went, I'm a big sports fan, that's part of my life I didn't talk about. We went to a Clippers game together, went to dinner first, and he said, "Don't tell Mom yet, but I think I want to apply to law school." And I said, "Okay, whatever you think best." My second son has no interest in law, and I don't think will ever go to law school. My younger 2 kids are 19 and 15, and it's too early to know. Does the fact that both of my son's parents are law professors influence his choice? Yeah, I mean, he had such a different upbringing than I did. I never knew a lawyer, I never knew an academic until I went off to, college and law school. A college university professor, I went to college and law school. He grew up with so many of our friends being lawyers and professors, so when he went to law school, it wasn't a big deal for him to meet lawyers. Undoubtedly, there was an influence on him, and I'm so proud of him as I'm equally proud of each of my kids. I don't know any other way to answer the question. One of the really fun things now is my son and I are handling an appeal together in the Federal Court of Appeals, and my co-counsel in the case I filed in the Supreme Court asking for review for the man who got 200 years for having child pornography is my daughter-in-law, Kim. And so it's fun to get to work with them. It's one of the real joys of my professional life and personal life.
Well, before we close out the program, I want to remind you of 3 things. 1, to complete your survey about this program and to consider volunteering and suggesting other speakers. 2nd, please discard the remainder of your lunch. We want to be good neighbors to the School of Humanities. And 3rd, consult the website to register for the Nicole Mitchell talk in November on the 13th. And there will also be clips of a short interview with Dean Chermerinsky about equity and diversity. But for now, I think let's give a good round of applause to Dean Chermerinsky.